go. So tonight's presentation is going to be focusing at personal and battlefield leadership. And we're going to be looking at the lives of John C. Breckinridge, FranzSigel, and as Cindy pointed out, how they clashed at the Battle of Newmarket. Now, to start off this presentation, I'd like to share a quote from the 6th President of the United States, John Quincy Adams. He said, "If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader." Now, leadership can be studied and defined in different ways, but this evening we want to look at the lives, the leadership, and the battle of a Confederate general and a Union general. The battle where they fought each other was Newmarket on May 15th, 1864. The Battle of Newmarket is usually remembered for the Virginia Military Institute cadets and their leadership. But who was commanding the armies who battled it out on that rainy afternoon in the Shenandoah Valley? Tonight, we're going to take a break from talking about the cadets, and we're going to focus on the two men who commanded the clashing armies. So let's start off with the Confederate general at the battle, or commanding general at the battle. There were some other Confederate generals there as well, I suppose. John C. Breckinridge. Now, we passed his historical birthday just a couple weeks ago. He was born on January 16th, 1821. And his father died when he was quite young, and his mother went into some hard times. So he moved around through extended family for much of his youth. His uncles became very influential in his life and helped him get into good colleges, including Princeton and also Transylvania University, which is there in Kentucky, his home state. Now, Breckinridge had an interest in military matters. He even tried to serve in the Mexican-American War, but he never got out there to see active combat and felt a bit disappointed by that experience. He was a successful lawyer. He settled in Lexington, Kentucky, did well for himself, married, would eventually have 7 children, and he started to rise in the community and rise into positions of government. So he represented Kentucky in the state legislature and then in the halls of Congress. Politically, Breckinridge was a Democrat. In the politics of his era, he was opposed to the movement of Know-Nothingism, which was anti-immigrant. Breckinridge did own slaves, and he supported legislation in favor of slavery, but privately he expressed his hatred of the institution. Now, in 1856, John Breckinridge became the youngest president in United States history, vice president. He was the vice president for James Buchanan, the youngest one in US history. I got that part of it right. And by the time the 1860 presidential election came around, he thought he might want to be the president. So he did run. He was one of 3 Democrat candidates on the ticket that year in the 1860 presidential election. Now, I'm pretty sure all of us on this Zoom know how that election turned out. The Democrats split the ticket 3 ways, and Abraham Lincoln of the newly formed Republican Party won the election. So Breckinridge got to finish out that lame duck session with Buchanan while secession was going on in parts of the Deep South. Breckinridge counseled for moderation. He really didn't say a lot publicly, just kind of trying to get through the situation. He ended up in a very unique position when he was no longer vice president. So the day that Lincoln became president and the new executives came into office, Breckinridge became a state senator, because this was still the time period when the states were choosing their senators for the US Senate, and his state, Kentucky, chose Breckinridge to represent them. So the day he steps out of office as vice president, he becomes a state senator. So he still gets to be in the hot seat, so to speak, in Washington. And it's a little more challenging for him because Kentucky is that border state where they have slavery. They're not quite sure what they want to do at that point in 1861 as far as it goes with the secession movement or stay in the Union. What do we do? Breckinridge continues to advocate for reason, for thinking, for discussion, but events are moving faster than that. And I'd like to share a quote with you from this period of turmoil that he was dealing with. Breckinridge said, "Yes, the truth will prevail. You may smother it for a time beneath the passions and the prejudices of men, but those passions and prejudices will subside, and the truth will reappear as the rock reappears above the receding tide. I believe this country will yet walk by the light of these principles. Bright and fixed as the rock-built lighthouse in a stormy sea, they will abide, a perpetual beacon to attract the political mariner to the harbor of the Constitution." So Breckinridge pins a lot of his political thinking, a lot of his hopes on the Constitution, and continues referring constituents and those around him back to the Constitution in the spring of crisis in 1861. Now, that wasn't going to last forever. Events continued sweeping at a rather rapid pace. Congress goes out of session. Breckinridge returns to Kentucky. And then a series of events unfolds. Breckinridge's oldest son, who's in his middle teens, decides to run away from home in Kentucky and go enlist for the Confederacy. Then Breckinridge kind of goes to the wrong picnic at the wrong time, and some federal authorities start thinking they need to arrest him because he might be leaning pro-Confederate. Hearing that they might arrest him, and in Breckinridge's mind for no good reason, Breckinridge decides he doesn't want to spend the next few years in jail and, fighting this out through litigation. So he decides to go ahead and follow his son into the Confederate ranks. So in October, he writes a letter. This is after he's left Kentucky, and he declares that the Union no longer exists, according to his view of the Constitution, and that Kentucky must choose on her own what she wanted to do, but he didn't have to represent her in the United States Congress anymore. He declared his Southern sympathies officially and is in Confederate uniform. Federal court reacts quickly, indicts him for treason, labels him a traitor, and it's going to be really bad if they ever capture him. Well, Breckinridge puts on Confederate gray, and he becomes a pretty good military leader. He takes command of the Kentucky Orphan Brigade, and I remember the very first time I heard about this unit, long time ago, I was pretty little, and I thought that everyone in the brigade was actually an orphan, like they had lost their parents. That's not the case. They were called the Orphan Brigade because as Kentuckians, their home state doesn't leave the Union. So they felt that they were orphaned from their homeland or from their mother state. So Breckinridge commands the Orphan Brigade, pretty famous unit out in the Western Theater. He fights at the Battle of Shiloh. He's at Baton Rouge, Stones River, action around Jackson, Mississippi, the Battle of Chickamauga. At the Battle of Missionary Ridge, Breckinridge's son is captured. He will eventually be released from prison, and that's just prior to the Battle of New Market scenario happening in spring of 1864. Well, like many other fine men, Breckinridge got into conflict with Braxton Bragg, and it got so bad that Breckinridge got transferred east, where he had a meeting with Robert E. Lee in Richmond and got command of the Trans-Allegheny Department, which was 18,000 square miles, and he had 5,000 troops to defend it. The Trans-Allegheny Department ran from the Blue Ridge Mountains west into parts of West Virginia or Western Virginia at the time. It had just become a state, but the Confederates were still calling it Western Virginia, and into parts of Kentucky. So he has this huge, rather mountainous district to defend. And that brings us to the spring of 1864, and we'll hit pause on the timeline with Breckinridge for just a moment. So let's talk about Breckinridge's leadership as seen up to this point in politics and in the American Civil War. Breckinridge had proved that he had an understanding of politics and war, and that he could learn quickly for military action, for military command. Breckinridge was a sensitive commander, so he understood the cost of war. He valued the lives of his men. He is often recorded having an emotional reaction after the battle or seeing his casualties after combat. Breckinridge had charisma, and he had the skill to back it up. And coming into the Shenandoah Valley in the spring of 1864, which is just about a year after Stonewall Jackson's death, he is seen as the next possible Stonewall, defender of the Shenandoah Valley. It also helps that part of the time Breckinridge rides a sorrel horse. And there's some references to people in the Shenandoah Valley thinking, oh, it's gonna be our new Jackson. Look, he even rides the same color famous horse. Now, Breckinridge had the determination to win. And so much of leadership starts with what is in our minds. I think about the quote that is in Shakespeare's Henry V, all things are ready if our minds be so. Breckinridge didn't have a lot of resources to use in this military setting, but he had a determination, and that was a pretty good head start for him. And finally, Breckinridge could adapt, and he could innovate when needed on the battlefield, making decisions quickly, changing plans to better the situation for him and his troops in the field. So now that we've taken a brief look at Breckinridge's life and identified some key points of his leadership and personality, let's go ahead and meet our other general for the evening, FranzSigel. Now, he was born November 18th, 1824 in Baden, Germany. His education was received at Karlsruhe Military Academy, a fine military school in Europe, and he was greatly inspired by this military training, and he wanted to think of himself as this great and wonderful military officer. He took part in the 1848 revolution, which took place in the German states at that time. And he helped to form a militia of these revolutionaries. He ended up commanding about 4,000 of them. And it became this really big thing in the legends of Germans and Germans immigrating to America shortly thereafter. But the problem is his legendary leadership of this 4,000 numbered militia doesn't end so well because he got defeated. And then Sigel is basically chased across Europe, always one step ahead of the police as he moves country to country, job to job, trying to figure out how he's going to be able to build a life for himself. He eventually decides he will go to the land of Washington and Jefferson because he has heard that there is freedom to think and freedom to explore big political and educational ideas in the United States. So he embarks upon a boat, makes the crossing across the Atlantic, and steps off on May 15th, 1852, 12 years to the day before he will fight at the Battle of Newmarket. Just a little interesting coincidence there. So he starts off in New York City, works to build a small business there. It's not quite where he wants to live. He gets married. His family will eventually have 5 children. He moves his family out to St. Louis, Missouri. And here, Sigel starts to find his stride. He loves to organize things, and he's very passionate about education and ideals of freedom. He becomes the director of the public schools in St. Louis, and he also becomes a very influential leader in the German-American immigrant community, which has seen a couple waves of immigration over the decades. There was one in 1830, and then the major wave in 1848 following the big revolutions, when you had a lot of revolutionaries fleeing to the United States. So here's a quote from FranzSigel. It comes a little later in his life, but it reflects well many of his ideas and how it reflected into how he acted and how he responded in his new country, the United States. What shall be the future of our country? Let us hold fast to this thought. Let us not forget that we have sworn loyalty to the Republic, that thousands of our compatriots have given their blood in defense of its unity and freedom, and that we are American citizens. Americanism judges a man by what he is, not by what his blood origin may be. And this type of thinking becomes a big part of Sigel's motivation. He wants to give back to this country that he now calls his own. And this becomes very evident as the Civil War breaks out. So Sigel uses his influence, his writing for German-American newspapers, as people come to him and ask for advice because he's seen as this leader in their community, he uses that influence for the Union. And he builds upon this legend that these exiled revolutionaries still have about his military prowess from 1848. And so we get sketches and we get images like the one you're seeing on the screen right now of Sigel in a fine uniform, looking quite European, looking like he would know what he's doing with an army in the field. The German-American press bought the ideal, crafted the ideal, and it remained to be seen if Sigel could follow up on that image. So he went into recruiting, he did a lot of pro-union writing, and he gets himself promoted, becoming one of the very first politically appointed generals in 1861. Now, he loses the Battle of Carthage, but the loss actually helps to spur recruiting efforts. He becomes a brigadier general on August 7th, 1861. He fights at the Battle of Wilson Creek in Missouri. He causes trouble in the battle by not communicating very well, but he manages to retreat skillfully. And this becomes a little bit of a trend with Sigel. One of my good friends and colleagues in the history field, we have this running joke, like if you had to pick a general that you had to retreat with, who would you go with? And she and I have both decided it's Sigel because he just manages these orderly retreats. He can get an army off the field in good order, even if they're soundly defeated. Not really what a general wants to be known for, but it is unique. We'll give him that. Battle of Pea Ridge, which takes place in March 1862, Sigel commands 2 divisions, and he personally spends time directing Union artillery. Artillery is Sigel's favorite thing to go play with on the battlefield. He does win a victory at Pea Ridge and defeats Major General Earl Van Dorn on the 2nd day of the battle. This earns him a promotion to Major General on March 21st, 1862. After that, Sigel enters the Shenandoah Valley for the very first time, and he fights unsuccessfully against General Thomas J. Jackson, Stonewall, in the valley. Unfortunately for Sigel, he's going to add more defeats to his record. The Second Battle of Bull Run associates him with another defeat. He commands the 11th Corps of the Army of the Potomac through March 1863, leaving just in time to miss the Battle of Chancellorsville, where they kind of have another defeat, or at least the Corps does. Through all of this, there is a phrase that becomes a rallying cry for the German Americans in Union uniform, and that is, "I fights mit Sigel." They firmly believed it. It was a big deal, a source of pride. They continue to see him as a leader. Now, it kind of became a joke amongst others in the federal uniform, and they would say, "I runs mit Sigel," poking fun at German American units. Now, Sigel's reputation is connected to how America views German American immigrants during the Civil War period. which often was not in a positive light. They'd often be made fun of, made into cartoons, things like that. So Sigel feels like he is representing something different. He needs to follow through on his image, on his reputation, and help his community of immigrants be able to be more accepted into mid-19th century American society. Well, Sigel goes on inactive duty in 1863, and he stays on inactive duty until the spring of 1864. Meanwhile, the German-American presses are quite influential, and they are clamoring for Sigel to be put back in command because he is still a hero for them. So in the spring of 1864, which is a presidential election year, Abraham Lincoln is looking to win the German-American vote in the North. And that's part of the reason that he put Sigel back in command for the New Market campaign. So what can we say? What are some nice things we can say about Sigel's leadership? Because he often gets a really bad reputation, or at least, we kind of see it that way sometimes. Sigel was a fantastic organizer. He's kind of like McClellan in this sense. He could take an untrained army, put them through the paces, and get them ready for the field in a really organized and efficient way. Sigel was loyal to his friends, which is a good character quality, but it also became a fault in his military career when he would promote his friends over maybe more capable officers. Sigel valued education. As we've seen, he served as the superintendent of the St. Louis schools prior to the war, and he was always trying to learn more and better himself as a person and as a military commander. Sigel understood the value of image and the value of influence, but this can also be seen as a fault because it sometimes blurred his perception of reality. And he loved the ideals of freedom and liberty, which can be a powerful motivating factor in his military career. So having met our two generals here, we get to the spring of 1864. And you should be seeing on your screen a picture overlooking the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. So on May 2nd, 1864, Ulysses S. Grant becomes Lieutenant General of the Federal Armies. He comes to Washington and he's going to be in charge of putting together a strategy that will be a coordinated effort of Union armies across the country in an effort to get the Civil War to an end with a Union victory as soon as possible. Now, part of Grant's plan is to put pressure on multiple points and threaten supply bases, particularly in Virginia. Grant does not want Confederate armies to be able to shift reinforcements to each other. And in Virginia, he devises a three-pronged strategy. So General Meade will take the Army of the Potomac and some other army detachments, and they will head into what we now call the Overland Campaign, which will smash through central Virginia toward Richmond and culminate with the so-called Siege of Petersburg. Then, while that's happening, another general, Benjamin Butler, is supposed to attack toward Richmond in what becomes known as the Bermuda Hundred Campaign. So kind of picture it in the peninsula area, pushing toward Richmond. Then, coming down from the northern and into the western part of the state of Virginia through the Shenandoah Valley, FranzSigel is supposed to march a Union army and tie up Confederate forces that defend the Shenandoah Valley and prevent them from going to the aid of the other pressured Confederates in the state. It looks great on paper. It doesn't quite work out the way Grant had planned, though, for a variety of reasons. We're going to focus in on the New Market campaign. So Sigel has one basic job. He is supposed to march into the Shenandoah Valley and tie up the Confederate forces there. On the other side, Breckinridge has to counter this from the Trans-Allegheny Department, his new command. and the orders start to fly. On May 1st, 1864, Robert E. Lee sends a series of directions to Breckinridge. And I'd like to share some excerpts with you because it helps us set the stage and try to roll back to that day when these generals don't know how it's going to turn out, and the leadership decisions that they make will impact that outcome. So this is Lee to Breckinridge. General, I gather from the report of scouts recently from the Valley that Averill, Union cavalry commander, has set out on an expedition, the design of which is either to reach some point on the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad or to effect the capture of Stanton. The general impression is that he will pursue the route which took him on his last raid. I think it would be well to have everything prepared to meet him and, in conjunction with General Imboden, to destroy him if possible. The enemy will probably make a diversion in the Kanawha Valley, that's in West Virginia, to keep your forces occupied while he accomplishes his main design. I am inclined to think that his object is to move on Stanton. If so, you might move against his line of communication while Imboden holds him in front, or concoct some other plan of defeating him. These movements in the Western Department will probably be simultaneous with the attack by Grant here, who has recently been reinforced by Burnside's army from Annapolis, so it will be impossible to communicate with you. A late report from a citizen places General Sigel at Martinsburg, but this conflicts with former reports. I am very respectfully your obedient servant, R.E. Lee. Lee correctly guesses that Sigel's objective will be Stanton, Virginia, and we'll switch to a map in just a moment so you'll be able to see that location in case you're not familiar with it. Now, Sigel gets some orders, Sigel sends a report on the same day, May 1st, 1864. He already has his orders. So he sends off some reports to Lieutenant General Grant. First off, he forwards along a dispatch from General Crook, who has details of the cavalry raid, which is targeting the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad. Lee guessed correctly on that one as well. Sigel says, I have no positive information yet whether a large force of the enemy is in the Shenandoah Valley. From all reports received, I believe there is not. McNeil and Imboden with 1,000 men and Rosser with 2,000 men are near Front Royal and Woodstock. These are cavalry. Their pickets at Cedar Creek and their scouts are at Winchester. General Elzey has probably moved from Stanton to Woodstock with about 3,000 or 4,000 infantry and artillery. We will occupy Winchester today with all our forces, consisting of about 4,000 infantry, 1,000 cavalry, and 3 batteries, and will push our advance toward Cedar Creek, FranzSigel. Now, Sigel clearly doesn't really know what's going on in the valley that he will be marching into. In fact, he doesn't even know that Breckinridge is the new commander tasked with defending that Trans-Allegheny Department, which includes the Shenandoah Valley. He mentions General Elzey, who was the previous commander. He makes a guess that there aren't any forces in the area, but he doesn't really know, and he'll find out as he marches in. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look here at the map. And you can see that I have circled the town of Newmarket in blue on the map. And now I'm going to attempt to use my laser pointer. There we go. Thank you very much to Pat for showing me how to make this work. So let's point out a few of these locations. Bunker Hill is up here where the laser pointer is. That's where the Union Army is going to start the Newmarket campaign from. The Martinsburg to Bunker Hill area is where the Union Army starts. Then we have Winchester, and then the whole series of towns moving up the valley. There we go. And note that when you're talking about geography in the Shenandoah Valley, up is when you are moving south, and down is when you are going north because of how the elevation runs and how the rivers flow. The Shenandoah River flows down to the Potomac, so we would say that the Confederates are going to move down the valley toward the rivers, or toward the Potomac. All right, so you can see Newmarket on the map. Let me point out just a couple others. Hopefully the laser will continue working. Here's Harrisonburg. Stanton is here, and Stanton is Sigel's objective. He has one task. If you're familiar with those billboards or the phrasing, you had one job. Sigel had one job: get to Stanton. Why Stanton? Because, sorry, I'm gonna get this laser pointer. Because Stanton is a rail town, and it has a railroad connection to the east, and it would be a way that you could poise a Union army onto Robert E. Lee's far extended flank. One more place to point out to you on this map, and that is Lexington, at the far upper end of the valley. So, since we're somewhat familiar with the map, let's go ahead and we will keep moving through the campaign quickly to get our armies to Newmarket. So on April 29th, Sigel leaves Martinsburg. He heads for Bunker Hill and Winchester. He arrives successfully in Winchester on May 1st. Things are going well. He's moving rather quick. But then it slows down because Sigel decides his troops need more training. So he hosts basically what we would call, in modern terms, war games, or maybe a reenactment. He divides his army into different sides, sends them out into the field, and says, you're going to practice fighting each other. Of course, not with real ammunition. It's an innovative idea for its time, but the problem was Sigel loses the confidence of his commanders at this point, at the regimental level and a couple of brigade commanders. They start thinking Sigel's not quite right in the head, and they lose confidence in him pretty early in the campaign, and this will have an effect on the coming battle. Well, finally, almost over a week later, on May 9th, Sigel decides to move from Winchester to Strasburg. Strasburg here, Winchester here. So he's moved about 20 miles up the valley. Then 2 days later, he moves about 20 miles more to Woodstock. And at Woodstock, he makes a really exciting discovery, because in their haste to leave town, the Confederate cavalry left behind some telegrams in the telegraph office, which lets Sigel know he's not really facing any major Confederate force. Breckinridge, that Confederate infantry commander, he is a long ways away. Well, Sigel decides it'd be a good idea to sit and wait and think about it for a while. So he takes the information and he literally sits on it, giving Breckinridge time to scramble his army. And scramble he does. Another photo of the valley and the quick outline of Sigel's march. So on May 8th, Breckinridge arrives from the Virginia-Tennessee border in Stanton, in the middle of the Shenandoah Valley, and he begins gathering as many troops as he can. He'll bring 2 brigades with him from the Virginia-Tennessee border area, and he puts out a call for reserve units, the local militia units that haven't gone off to war yet. He puts out the call for troops. On May 10th, Breckinridge's orders arrive in Lexington at Virginia Military Institute. Previously, the cadets superintendent had offered the services of the Corps of Cadets in the field. On May 10th, orders arrive for them to join Breckinridge's gathering army in Stanton. 2 days later, the cadet battalion will arrive. That's the same day, May 12th, that Breckinridge's army is fully assembled. May 13th, he starts moving north down the valley to encounter Sigel. So he quickly scrambles about 4,000 troops. He's going up against about 600 with Sigel. Meanwhile, John Mosby starts harassing Sigel's supply lines. McNeil and Imboden, cavalry commanders in the valley itself, fight some delaying tactics, do annoying things to Sigel, which kind of holds him in place in Woodstock, allowing Breckinridge to move his gathered force quickly. Now, on May 13th and 14th, there's an important action that occurs near Newmarket, Virginia, that sets up the scenario for how the battle unfolds on the 15th itself. So Sigel decides to send off a detachment of cavalry. It's going to be part of the 1st New York Lincoln Cavalry, part of the 15th New York Cavalry, and Cole's command. It's put under command of Colonel Boyd. They are sent east through what's called Luray Valley. And then, as you can see here on the map, sorry, trying to get this here. They are going to come into Newmarket Gap on Massanutten Mountain, which is the only passable place for troops to cross this long mountain that runs in the Shenandoah Valley from Strasburg to Harrisonburg. So Boyd starts to cross his cavalry column over the mountain. Confederate cavalry is waiting for him down below, and there's a clash. The Union cavalry is driven back. Confederates are going to hold the Newmarket area. This happens on May 13th. On May 14th, Sigel decides to start dividing his army up, and he sends off what would be the equivalent of a brigade under Colonel Augustus Moore. And they're going to move up the Valley Pike. You can see the map, or see the arrows there on the map. And Imboden's cavalry is going to fight delaying tactics all the way to the town of Newmarket. So the Confederate cavalry manages to hold a piece of high ground called Shirley's Hill just outside the town of Newmarket. And as darkness falls, the Union army is strung out over 20 miles of road. Sigel, with the main body of army, is still at Woodstock. He's got a regiment halfway in between, which he sent off as kind of an afterthought. And then he has Moore's brigade in Newmarket facing Confederates, and they have fought on this day. So the Confederate cavalry sends off a quick message to Breckinridge saying, if you get up here, we have good ground. Maybe we should fight a battle, or at least see what Sigel wants to do. So on the morning of May 15th, where were the generals? Breckinridge has managed to bring up his entire force in the middle of the night. He deploys them behind Shirley's Hill so that the Union troops in the area can't see how many soldiers he really has. Breckinridge makes sure his army has breakfast. He wants to make sure that they are ready for this day's battle if it comes. And he also employs deception. He brings units to the top of the hill, shows them, if you will, to the Union troops below, brings them back, moves them up again, so any Union soldiers counting down below think that Breckinridge has a much larger army than he really does. Now, Breckinridge had got some messages the day before. First, he heard that the cavalry raid toward the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad had been turned back. That was significant. Now, all he had to worry about was defeating Sigel and driving him out of the valley. He had also managed to get a letter from Robert E. Lee that said, if you can drive back the different expeditions threatening the valley, it would be very desirable for you to join me with your whole force. And so it is that around noon, Breckinridge, who has sat on Shirley's Hill for all morning and offered battle to the Union troops below, at noon, he decides to switch from a defensive to an offensive battle to accomplish this mission that has been given to him by Lee. Get the Union troops out of the valley and come help in the overland campaign. Meanwhile, Sigel is having a very different experience. He is still miles up the road, and he spends part of the morning, I am sorry to say it, but according to David Hunter Strother, Sigel spends part of his morning looking for his favorite brandy flask flask and accusing everyone he meets of stealing it. I don't know if he ever found it. Please don't put that in the chat comments. His army's strung out, messages are coming in that there is a fight getting ready to unfold at Newmarket. Finally, Sigel gets himself together. He arrives on the field at Newmarket about lunchtime, according to his officers. So probably about noon, about the same time that Breckinridge has made the decision to advance and turn this into a Confederate offensive battle. All right. I was talking with Cindy, and we're not going to get into the super intricate details right now of who moved here and who moved there. I just want to give you a general sense of the battle so we can get a general sense of what these commanders were thinking and how they responded to the situations. So let's try our laser pointer. We have the Confederates lined up on Shirley's Hill. We have Union forces across the way on Manners Hill. So this is the situation at noon. Breckinridge puts his army, his entire force, into long lines of battle. He establishes a reserve, which includes the cadets from Virginia Military Institute, and he puts them a few hundred yards to the rear. So they will follow the lines of battle, but not engage unless needed. So in long lines of battle, Breckinridge is going to sweep across the Newmarket battlefield and through the town. And he will basically hold this formation for the entire battle. Union troops are also going to be in relatively long battle lines, and they're just going to move from south to north, pushing through several different positions of the battle. It's a relatively easy battle to understand, to map, and if you have the opportunity or if you've been out to the battlefield, it's pretty easy to follow. So that would be the first position, moving down Shirley's Hill, pushing the Union troops off Manor Hill. So now, oh goodness, this map is a little blurry, for which I apologize. Now we are looking at what would be the second position, which is called the River Road position. So the Union forces have been pushed back here. Confederates are continuing to advance in that long line, but notice what's happening up here to the north on what's called Bushong Hill. Sigel's coming in and he's bringing troops that are following him on the Valley Pike. He's lining them into fresh lines of battle. So as his lines are collapsing out here in the River Road position, they're going to fall back and meet kind of fresh troops in that they haven't engaged in combat yet, but they've just marched 20 miles. So I'll leave it to you to determine how fresh these troops are. Meanwhile, notice that the Confederate cavalry has crossed to the opposite side of what's known as Smith Creek. You can kind of see it running as a ribbon there. So they are on an opposite side of a creek hanging out on the flank. That will be important in a moment. All right, I believe this is the last map and it is the final position of the battle. So this is going to be taking place in the early part of the afternoon. It's been a pretty much continuous fight from position to position. And here we have the battle lines around the Bushong farm. So if you've been out to Newmarket battlefield, this is the fight that happens in the area, the land around the Virginia Museum of the Civil War, the one that's operated by Virginia Military Institute. So here we have Confederate battle lines. It's going to extend across the Valley Pike. There's going to be a little bit of cavalry infantry action out in this area. We have the Union lines running along Bushong Hill. What's Sigel doing? He's running around placing artillery. He's not really commanding his army. He's worried about where the guns are. And as things are kind of going from bad to worse in his battle day, he stops speaking in English and he starts speaking German. And that doesn't work so well because his brigade commanders and most of his regiment commanders speak English. So they're not really sure what he wants them to be doing, which creates a bit of a leadership problem. What's Breckinridge doing? Breckinridge is behind his battle lines observing what's happening. And there comes a point where Breckinridge has to make a decision. So there is a gap which opens up in Breckinridge's lines at the Bushong farm. It's in the middle. His troops are, his units on the battle line are strained. They're not able to close the gap. The Union regiments are still charging, trying to break through his lines at this point. And Breckinridge has to make a decision. He decides to put in his reserve of the Virginia Military Institute cadets. So about 257 young men, most in their late teens, are put into battle. Breckinridge doesn't like the decision. He says, put in the boys and may God forgive me for the order. But he makes the decision and he sees it through. Now, the Corps of Cadets goes onto the battle line. They are firing, they are under fire, and it's shortly after they fill this gap in Breckinridge's line that the entire Confederate battle line starts making advancing movements. They can't really all see each other because it's raining and there's dense battle smoke and just it's hanging in the fields that way. So they don't all see each other, but there are general movements from Confederate units along the line, including from the VMI cadets. And they will rush across an open field, now called the Field of Lost Shoes, capture at least one cannon, drive off some Union gunners. Other Confederate regiments advancing will push Sigel's army into retreat. Not a great day for Sigel, tough day for Breckinridge, a muddy, miserable day for everyone. And the casualties will total about 588 for the Confederates and about 744 for the Union. So what are the outcomes? Sigel has to retreat, but remember how I told you he can retreat masterfully? He does it again. He manages to get his army to the Shenandoah River, he gets them across, and the bridge is burned. And since it's been raining for a while, the rivers are flooded and the Confederate army is not going to be able to pursue him that day. Sigel gets his army off the field. Breckinridge, remember I mentioned his cavalry is on the other side of Smith Creek, which is a raging torrent of water. Somehow the cavalry gets across, but they're not able to come back. We can talk about that in the questions if we need to. His cavalry is out of action. So the Confederates are not able to use cavalry to slow Sigel's pursuit. So he's going to get away. Now Sigel is very depressed and he realizes the seriousness on the national level and on the personal level of his defeat at Newmarket. Just in the hours after the battle, he expresses to his staff officers that he wished he had died on the field. He takes his defeat extremely hard. And he realizes another defeat on his record is not going to uphold that legend that he is this military commander who's trained in Europe and has all the tricks of the battlefield. He wished he had died in glory on the field of battle, but instead he's fated to live. Breckinridge, on the other hand, has saved the Shenandoah Valley for the Confederacy, at least for a couple more weeks, and he moves with a majority of his troops to join Robert E. Lee. He has protected Lee's extended flank. Sigel couldn't get to his objective. Sigel is relieved of command shortly after the Battle of Newmarket. Breckinridge goes east, joins the Army of Northern Virginia. A few months later, will become Secretary of War for the final days of the Confederacy. Then things don't go so well for Breckinridge. As the Confederacy fails and surrender begins, he flees the country. And he eventually comes back to the United States, but he struggles to provide for his family and he dies quite young in 1875. Sigel, however, goes into politics. He becomes a successful newspaper publisher, and he's still revered until his dying day by the German-American community. So what are some leadership lessons that we can learn from these men and from what happened at Newmarket? Sigel teaches us about organization, that it is necessary, but it should not be allowed to hamper our decisions and our actions. Breckinridge teaches us about committing. He puts his whole army, his whole force into the field and determining to put forth every effort to win. Neither of them was a perfect leader. But then we have to ask ourselves if a perfect leader exists on Earth. Leaders and leadership can be defined in different ways. Both Sigel and Breckinridge succeeded in some areas and failed in others. As we think about their legacy as leaders, though, I want to come back to the quote that we started with. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. If we use this quote as our premise, we can see that both Breckinridge and Sigel had the charisma to form, organize, and lead volunteer armies. They got those volunteer troops to follow them to the battlefield of Newmarket. And in the end, we look back to these men and to their legacy as leaders because they can inspire us to dream more, learn more, and do more. If I can take a moment to just share personally how they have inspired me through the research that I've got to do on them and this battle. Breckinridge inspires me to face the odds, to make informed decisions, and to commit to the contest. Sigel, on the other hand, inspires me to seek out new lands or experiences, probably a better way to describe that. To stay organized, but not become a thrall to that organization, and to have an undying love for country. What good is history if it does not challenge us, if it doesn't frighten us and inspire us? As we close the presentation, I would like to invite you to consider how these two men and their battle on May 15th, 1864 can inspire. We learn and we study history in the books and the archived letters, but the questions still remain. What do we do with the information that we learn? Do we sit on the gained knowledge like Sigel, or will we take the information and move forward with it like Breckinridge? Thank you very much.